was just saying as I was muted, it's a pleasure to be here. I thank David for the kind invitation. I'm happy to represent the Eisenhower Society in making this talk about Eisenhower. I do feel a little bit like the odd man out because as Rich described your activities and as it was evident from what you are all about, the Civil War is your main focus. Eisenhower was very interested in the Civil War and took some of his ideas from what he learned about the Civil War, but that's not what I'm talking about tonight. I'm going to be talking about Eisenhower. Let me first off commend you all for what you do and your interest in history. The fact is that history is not just for students, it's for all of us. And I love it when I see organizations that come out of genuine interest in learning about the past and arguing about the past and remembering that history is an argument without end. There aren't final answers about the big questions, even about things that you think you know about the Civil War. I'm going to talk about this talk in 4 segments tonight. I'm going to introduce you to Eisenhower very briefly, but I think it's necessary. I'm going to walk you through some of the notable moments of Eisenhower's life, which will be a fast-paced walk. I will then turn, and David suggested that this would be of interest to you, to the Eisenhower experience in Gettysburg. And then I'll cap it off at the end, because I want my friend Carol Hegeman to be happy, to talk a little bit about the Eisenhower Society and what we are up to, trying to maintain and sustain the legacy of this great American. So for starters, with this audience, I don't think I have to remind you why Eisenhower mattered. He was the supreme Allied commander in Europe in the Second World War and deserves a lot of the credit for the strategy and the ultimate crushing of Adolf Hitler and the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. A rather major achievement and one that was satisfactory to Eisenhower as being the pinnacle of his life. He had no intentions when he left the military in 1947 to ever seek a political office. But that ultimately happens in 1952 when he runs for president and wins decisively both in 52 and 56 and is a very popular 2-term president. And some of you are old enough as I am to remember as a person that Eisenhower was our president. The interesting thing about Eisenhower is that he was consistently popular as president. We have a president now who I don't believe has ever cracked 50% in popularity in 3.5 or 3 3/4 years. And other presidents have been underwater in that regard. Eisenhower's average popularity was over 60%, and he often reached higher in terms of public esteem for him. It had a lot to do with the quality of his persona. It had a lot to do with the fact that Americans were pretty satisfied with the state of the country during the years he was the steward of our fortunes. It had a lot to do with the fact that, with the exception of 2 recessions, we were moving forward economically, and you could be a working class American and feel very positive about your state of your opportunities for not just yourself, but for your children. And I think about that in terms of the 50s and the family I grew up in, where my father was a non-unionized factory worker. My mom didn't work because I had younger siblings at home. And yet, you know, my needs were met. They were very modest. We lived a very much a modest life, a working class life. But there was a great optimism in the country, and I think writ large that was true. And that's one of the reasons Eisenhower was so popular. Now, having said that, it's an interesting fact that there was a segment of the American public that didn't think much of Eisenhower when he was president. And that segment tended to be what you and I would call the pundit class, the people who were the movers and shakers in the media, particularly in Washington and New York and Boston, and historians from around the country, who then as now tend to be more on the liberal side politically, and who were fascinated by, and you could say, really in the thrall of Franklin D. Roosevelt as a model for presidential leadership. And look, I'm not here to get into a presidential ratings game, but I will say that without question, Roosevelt was the greatest president of the 20th century. There's no doubt about that. But Eisenhower didn't think that Roosevelt was his model for the kind of presidency he wanted to run. And because he was not, as he would put it, nagging Congress to do things and do things and do things, and because he operated often behind the scenes, as when he kneecapped Joe McCarthy in 1954, Eisenhower didn't get credit for a lot of the things that he actually accomplished in the White House. People didn't realize that he was kind of the puppet master pulling on the strings of the players around him. And there's plenty of scholarship, including some of my own, that provides a lot of evidence for this generalization. The point I want to make here very, very simply is that historians tended to view Eisenhower as much more a monarch than an active executive. And our president has both of those roles, right? It's written into our system that the president is both the monarchical figure and the active executive of the country. They didn't see the active executive much. They saw him playing a lot of golf. They only saw him as the benign monarch. But in fact, he was both. And when Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in 1962, at the request of Life magazine, polled the people he knew in the historical profession and asked them to rank the presidents. This is a year after Eisenhower leaves office. It's interesting that out of 34 presidents, Ike was number 34, he came out 22nd of those 34 presidents. He was ranked in with the likes of Calvin Coolidge and Chester Alan Arthur. I mean, it was not a place that today you would find Eisenhower. And that's the interesting point. And again, I can't belabor it because we have other things to cover, but over time, Eisenhower's status and ranking on the presidential stock exchange has been the most extraordinary thing that we have seen, because his rankings over the years have continued to rise. And in the most recent C-SPAN poll of scholars about presidents, he ranked 5th out of 44. And he hasn't done anything since January 20th, 1961, right? So then the question is, why is Eisenhower viewed so favorably today compared to how, when he left office, he was ranked by historians? And the answer lies in two different realms. Number one, look at who's been president since Eisenhower. Every president since Eisenhower, even strong two-term presidents, have had some major, what would you call it, defect in the way that they operated or in what happened in the country while they were president. Even Reagan, who is well respected today, even by liberal historians in most cases, you know, he had Iran-Contra. Bill Clinton had his Monica. George W. Bush, of course, had the disaster in Iraq, and so forth and so on. Eisenhower looks very good when you compare him with what has followed him. There isn't any president who looks better than Eisenhower from my perspective as a historian. The second thing that has changed historians' attitudes about Eisenhower is that we've had access since 1979, 1980 to the treasure trove of intimate documents about how he ran the presidency that is in the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. And I'm thinking particularly about something called the Ann Whitman Papers. She was his loyal secretary. She kept and organized virtually every piece of paper that came into the Oval Office. And that material, which Eisenhower actually drew on when he wrote his memoirs in Gettysburg in the 1960s, wound up in the Eisenhower Library. It took over a decade to get it all organized and ready for scholars to review. And when scholars began to dig in, they discovered that the caricature picture of Eisenhower as someone who basically worked 3 hours a day, hit the golf course, watched Westerns or played bridge at night, really missed what this presidency was about. It missed his temperament, it missed his diligence, and it missed his wisdom on so many issues. Now, again, if I were giving a different lecture, I would make it clear to you that I'm not a hagiographer of Dwight Eisenhower, that there were things he did that in retrospect weren't so good. And I'll be glad to answer some of those kinds of questions or cover that ground in Q&A if you're interested, or some other time. But my point would be that when you look at the totality of that presidency, from the documentary perspective and from the perspective of all of the years since he's been president, Eisenhower looks very good indeed. And while we can argue about whether he should be 5th out of 44 or 8th or something else, sure, there's no lock on the 5th place, but it tells you something about historians have come to appreciate Dwight Eisenhower. I'm going to share a screen now because I should have done that a minute ago, right? And move forward with this if I can. I'm getting a whiteboard, David. What am I going to do to get my thing? Do I have to do this? Let's see. Do I hit share or what?
Yes, you bottom center of your Zoom window, share your screen.
Yeah, I hit that.
Okay, and you should see your desktop with various, whatever applications you have.
You do.
Choose the PowerPoint.
Okay.
There you go.
That do it for us?
We got it.
Good.
Now
And
just go to slideshow.
Okay. And where will I find that? I see it.
Right there.
Got it. Are we good now?
Hit the upper left, the from start, the green arrow. There you go. We got it.
All right. Sorry about that delay, folks.
No problem.
There's the man we're talking about with his magnetic grin, which was one of the signature aspects of Dwight Eisenhower. He always gave you a more optimistic view of himself. This is the Eisenhower as a boy, but that's still a kind of a magnetic character. He's front and center there in Abilene, Kansas, where he grew up. So I just want to emphasize that a lot happened in the Eisenhower presidency. I think this slideshow will enable me to touch on a couple of the things that he was involved with and should be remembered for. But at the moment, I guess I'm going to use some of these slides to walk you through very quickly a storied life. He grew up in a modest circumstance, the wrong side of the tracks, as it were, in Abilene, Kansas, in a family that was pious, poor, and ambitious. The Eisenhowers were pretty well educated, even though they weren't wealthy, and they had an expectation that their kids would go on and get higher education. And Eisenhower himself, of course, gets his at West Point, which was a free education. His older brother, Edgar, goes to the University of Michigan, and his other brother goes to Kansas State University, and others went to different educational institutions or got into certificate programs. At West Point from 1911 to 1915, Ike was not a standout student. He was really most interested in football and having a good time. He, according to his biographers, accumulated quite a few demerits because he would come in late from New York City. He would stay out late. He really wasn't trying to be the perfect cadet. His career in football, unfortunately, came to an end early when he had a couple of knee injuries. And at one point, the knee injuries were serious enough that he might not have been commissioned as an officer in the military, which was something that would have destroyed him, I think. But he came through that and, of course, went on to notable things in the military. Here he is in Gettysburg in 1915. The yellow circle captures him with his class. Some of you know that this is a tradition for the ride to Gettysburg and each of the classes at West Point. This was Ike's class the stars fell on because so many of his classmates became generals in the Second World War. Nobody was necessarily predicting Ike was going to become a general, but he would show his stuff over and over again. His first posting in Texas resulted in him meeting this young woman named Mamie Doud, whose family was quite wealthy and tended to winter in Texas. Her father made enough money to retire early too, like by the age of 40. Mamie had quite a social calendar. Eisenhower, however, when he set his eyes on her, was not going to let go, and he would actually sit outside, as one of his biographers has said, would sit outside the Eisenhower or the Doud house while she was on a date, waiting for her to be done with the date, and then so he could pass a few words with her. I mean, if you look at him in this photograph, you have to say you can understand why Mamie fell for him. I mean, he's an extraordinarily good-looking guy, and he had a wonderful down-home personality. So that was a marriage that worked out. They married in 1916, and they were married for more than 50 years. Here they are in Gettysburg again. Eisenhower kept coming back to Gettysburg. He was in Gettysburg in 1915. He came back in 1919. You'll see an image of the reason he was back. He came back in 1918 to run Camp Colt during the First World War, essentially a tank training division. Had a very fine experience. That little boy is his son, Icky, who was kind of the mascot and who was the light of the Eisenhowers' life. But Icky came down with a disease at the age of 3 and passed away, and it was quite a shock to the Eisenhowers, and it actually was a test of their marriage. Ultimately, as I think many of you know, the Eisenhowers had a second son, John, who in his older years was the spitting image of Eisenhower. And John was the light then of the Eisenhower's life, and he had 4 children, and they themselves have had kids. Here he is in Gettysburg with some British officers at Camp Colt in 1918. I'm going to put in a plug for my friend Carol Hegeman here because her husband Paul is writing a book about Eisenhower and in the period up to Gettysburg, and I think he'll tell us some things nobody knows at this point. But you can see in his face that he's pretty happy doing what he's doing. Although it has to also be said that he was making the best of a bad situation because he wanted to fight in Europe. And it wasn't his time, he wasn't given the opportunity, and he had to overcome at first a kind of, I guess you'd say, disgruntlement that he didn't have that opportunity. But he made the most of his time in Gettysburg. I have to get in here something that will again resonate with you because of what we're dealing with now. The summer of 1918 was the summer of the great pandemic. And Eisenhower found that it hit home in Gettysburg, and hundreds of his soldiers came down with the Spanish flu, and a number of them died. Eisenhower himself was on the case consistently and with strength of character. He arranged to get places for these young men to be housed while they were being treated. He made sure that they were in the best circumstances they could be, and he was given a commendation for his alert and timely action then, as he would be later in his life. I referred to Ike coming to Gettysburg again in 1919 a minute ago. This is a photograph of him in eastern Wyoming. Not him, but his convoy. This was the cross-country convoy, which many people say was the seeds of Eisenhower's thoughts about the transcontinental highway, right? The national highway system, which he pushed for during his presidency. Well, he followed the old Lincoln Highway route, and that took him through Gettysburg. So he got another little glimpse of Gettysburg on this very trip. Here he is with Mamie and John. I'm guessing this is taking place in Panama, where Eisenhower was assigned in the early 1920s. There's a long story that's important about Eisenhower here, and that is the kind of grad school he went to in Panama with a one-on-one kind of experience with Fox Connor, the distinguished general who could see something in Eisenhower and who gave him a lot of heavy reading, including Clausewitz on war, which Eisenhower then would talk about to Connor in great detail when they were out riding every morning. And I think Eisenhower got the kind of education in Panama from Fox Connor that would prove really valuable to him to see the big picture of things. And it also created what I would call a humanities side of Eisenhower that people tend to underplay. This is Eisenhower, of course, in uniform during the Second World War, and one of the most famous images here. I'll give you a little footnote to all of this. I have a friend in Gettysburg who's the pastor of our local church, and his father lives in Millersville, Pennsylvania. And everybody knows about the fellow wearing the number 23, who Eisenhower was talking with. But it turns out that the fellow who's right in the middle of the picture lived for many years in Millersville, Pennsylvania, and died about 2 years before I learned who he was through the father of the minister in Gettysburg. And how I regret that I never had the chance to talk to him and interview him about that picture and about his experiences in the war. Just one of those, unexpected things. Here's Eisenhower with Churchill. I'll just simply say that Eisenhower admired Churchill a great deal, but he recognized that Churchill was impetuous and often wrong-headed in the things that he wanted to do. And I won't go into detail again, that's not the point of this lecture, but he managed Churchill very, very well. He spent a lot of time with Churchill on weekends when he was based in England. He knew Churchill's mindset, and he learned from Churchill, even at the same time that he had to control Churchill in his own way. And the one good example I'll give you of that occurred just before D-Day. Churchill wanted to go in the first day, in the first wave on D-Day. And Eisenhower obviously knew that that was an absurd idea that was far too dangerous. So Eisenhower got the king of England to say that if Churchill wanted to go in, he was going to go in too. And that was a little of Eisenhower's hidden hand. And of course, Churchill wasn't going to let the king go in, so Churchill backed off of that crackpot idea. Here's Eisenhower as the first commander of NATO. Actually, this picture is probably 1951 because it was in December of 1950 that Harry Truman, the president, asks Eisenhower to put on his uniform again and make order out of what was increasingly a chaotic situation among the Western allies in Western Europe at a time when the Soviet threat was very apparent. Just a quickie here, after the war, Eisenhower was chief of staff and had to oversee the demobilization of the army. And then he becomes president of Columbia University in 1948. And it was while he was president that the call comes from Harry Truman to re-enter the military, which as a 5-star general, he was obligated to do. In 1952, he gets another call, and that's from the people who wanted him to succeed Harry Truman as president. And I'm writing a book about this subject as we speak, and it's a fascinating story of how it goes from being not interested to being interested, but wanting to have a draft from the American people on the part of both Republicans and Democrats, to finally realizing he was going to actually have to campaign if he wanted to be president of the United States. And once Eisenhower put his chips in, he put all his chips in. He became as aggressive and effective a campaigner as you could find. And his whistle stop in 1952 was filled with ups and downs and interesting, what would we call it, sidebars, including his dealings with Senator Joe McCarthy, the Nixon Checkers Fund crisis, the Korea speech, and so forth. But as I said to you at the outset, he didn't have that much trouble defeating Democrat Adlai Stevenson that year. When I talked early in this lecture about Eisenhower's contributions to the country as president, I would have to say that in terms of what people know about Eisenhower, this has probably got to be number one. In fact, when historians in 1995 were asked to rank the most important accomplishments in America since World War II, the Eisenhower interstate system was on every top 10 list because it made America mobile in a way that it had never been, both for business and pleasure purposes. And of course, there was also the element of getting people more easily out of the major cities if there was going to be a nuclear incident and a nuclear exchange with the Russians. But I would downplay that side of it and upplay the emphasis that Eisenhower understood that a connected system and a connected America would be a more prosperous America. And of course, he creates NASA in wake of Sputnik. And some people say he was too slow. But the fact of the matter is that Eisenhower was always looking at the development of American nuclear technology and our space business in terms of what could be used for the good of mankind, not what would be used for destructive purposes. And he was forced, in effect, to expand what we did in terms of our defense. And I would say reluctantly, in many cases, because he was a very careful spender. But he went all in with NASA, and he provided the foundation for what Jack Kennedy would call for in 1961, which was, of course, America getting to the moon. And by the way, there was no missile gap. Eisenhower knew it. Kennedy was talking through his hat about that. And as soon as Kennedy became president, and I've looked at the Washington Post on this in '61, the missile gap goes away because Kennedy's reading the documents. He was offered those documents in 1960, but didn't want to see them because it was a good campaign argument that America was not keeping up with the Russians. One of Eisenhower's, of course, most signal actions as president was sending the troops in to Little Rock to assure that the 9 African-American students could attend Central High School. Again, a few of you may be old enough to remember this. I don't remember the case because I was a little boy at the time, but it was not something that was a given that he was going to send in troops. And the whole building of a Republican Party in the South was actually put on hold while Eisenhower did this because Southerners were livid. They were so wedded to segregation that they turned on Eisenhower in 1957 for doing what he did in Little Rock. But it was absolutely the right thing to do, and he has always been given credit for it. Balancing the federal budget was, of course, central to Eisenhower's mentality and his policy as president. He only was able to balance the budget 3 times out of 8 years. But you have to remember that when he became president, President Truman's budget was hugely out of balance because of NSC 68 and the Korean War. And because the Democrats controlled Congress for 6 of the 8 years Eisenhower was president, and they wanted to spend more than he wanted to spend, and he would have to meet them in the middle. But he did actually literally balance the budget 3 times. The fellows who are in this photograph with Eisenhower are his budget people. Joe Dodge is to his immediate left, and Maurice Stans, who some of you may remember as one of Richard Nixon's aides and his budget director, is on the far right. Eisenhower adds under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. He was someone who actually was the first president to put an inaugural prayer on when he was inaugurated in 1953. He was very much given to comparing or contrasting godless communism to America, a country of faith and many faiths. And that was central to understanding it. Here he is with Nikita Khrushchev. That is probably taken at Camp David in 1959 when he invites Khrushchev to try to deal with the Berlin crisis and actually has a Cold War thaw that lasted about 6-7 months until the shoot down of the U-2 in May of 1960. And then he's going to retire to Gettysburg. And this is probably what you're more interested in than what I've been talking about, though I hope what I've been talking about has been good. I noticed in Rich's backdrop, he's got a nice postcard of the Eisenhower home. I don't know if you all know this, but very little of what you're looking at was actually the house that Eisenhower bought in 1950 when he put down $42,000 for the Reading farm, which contained 189 acres of farmland that really needed help and that he was determined to upgrade. It's an interesting story that Mamie and Ike loved the 2 old trees that were in front of the Reading farmhouse, and Mamie fell in love with the brick oven, the German brick oven kitchen. And when they actually took possession of the house and had contractors look at it, they told them that the trees had to go, and so did the brick oven kitchen. So there are only small pieces like the stones that are in the sidebar of his little office in the farmhouse. That's about what's left of the original building. It took several years, in fact, close to 3 years to get it in full shape. And for those of you who are interested, it is open to the public. It is a National Historic Site. Carol Hegeman, for her entire career, learned everything she could about Eisenhower so she could curate this place as best possible. And that will continue to be done now. While he was in retirement, Eisenhower did a lot, much more than people realize. One of the central things he did was to write memoirs. He wrote Mandate for a Change, Waging Peace, and At Ease. And Mandate for a Change was published on November the 1st, 1963. 3 weeks for 3 weeks, it was selling like hotcakes. And then something happened on November 22nd, 1963. And nobody wanted to read about Eisenhower, except very loyal members of the Republican Party. So the timing for his book was not the best because everything became Jack Kennedy, Jack Kennedy. Nonetheless, Eisenhower did plow forward with the help of his son and William Bragg Ewald, one of his White House aides. He produced a second volume on the second term. These books are not exciting reading, but they are really valuable firsthand accounts of the major issues and personalities of the Eisenhower years. And I consult them regularly in the teaching and writing that I do. And I've found them that they're not necessarily going to tell you everything you want to know. For example, Eisenhower's real views about America and Vietnam, but they're going to tell you a lot about how he ran the Oval Office and what he thought of the people he dealt with. And I recommend these books to anybody. He loved showing off in Gettysburg to notable leaders of the world who'd come by. One of them was Nehru from India. The interesting story about Nehru is that Eisenhower at first didn't like Nehru because Nehru was leading a non-aligned bloc in the world, neither pro-communist nor pro-American. And Eisenhower thought it really was a zero-sum game, that you should be on the good guy's side. And so he and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, tended to speak ill of Nehru. But when Eisenhower invited Nehru to Gettysburg and spent 2 days talking world affairs with him, he got a much better sense of what Nehru was up to and much more sympathy for what Nehru was trying to do. And while he never went full hog into believing that neutralism was okay in the middle of a Cold War, I think his sensitivity was much raised by what he did in Gettysburg during his presidency. Whether he was president or ex-president, Eisenhower loved playing golf and played a heck of a lot of it. That little boy, of course, in the picture is David Eisenhower, his grandson, his only grandson, and someone in whom he invested a lot of mental energy. And David has written a very nice little book called Going Home to Glory, which I recommend to any of you, about his relationship with his grandfather. And it will tell you a lot about Gettysburg and Eisenhower's time in Gettysburg that I cannot go into here, but I will tell you one story. And that is this, that about 1963, Eisenhower, and David's 14 years old or so, Eisenhower asked David to paint some of the fence near the home. And he offers to pay him $0.25 an hour. And David agrees. Ike goes out to play golf for a few hours. When he comes back, he finds out that David had dropped his paintbrush to go play with a friend. And Eisenhower gave him a lecture about this and told him this is not what you do. And David was pretty upset for having let his grandfather down and having being lectured. But it was interesting because Eisenhower used a technique with his 14-year-old or 13-year-old grandson that he used with people who had worked for him in his administration who had messed up. And that is, after giving them a little lecture, he'd say, well, guess what? Everybody's entitled to one mess up a year. That's yours. Go back to work. Do the job. And people would walk over hot coals for it because of that attitude. And I think that that was something that David appreciated as well. That second picture, I believe, is Art Kennel, who I heard many Eisenhower stories from, and who often caddied for Ike and played golf with Ike when Ike was not able to find a partner. Ike tended to play a lot with Arthur Nevins, who was the caretaker for many years of the farm, and who was the brother of the great Civil War historian Allen Nevins. And Art Nevins and Ike were very close, and the wives were very close as well. So now you know something more about the Nevins family. And speaking of families, this is the John Eisenhower family, the son and 3 daughters, all of whom have gone on to accomplished careers in their own right. David is a lecturer at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. And it's interesting, my younger daughter works at the Annenberg School in an office not very far from David's. And sort of suggested she go and introduce herself to him at some point. John Eisenhower did divorce Barbara at some point and remarried. And I don't know whether Barbara remarried herself, but the Eisenhower family remains pretty close-knit, although there's always been a little bit of a sibling rivalry between David and Susan. One of the most notable people who visited Eisenhower during his post-presidency was Viscount Montgomery, also known as Monty. And there's a great little story there about how Monty got Ike in a bit of hot water by dragging him out on the battlefield and egging him on to criticize Robert E. Lee's operations of the Confederate lines during the Battle of Gettysburg. And he kept pushing and pushing Eisenhower to say what he would have done if he had been Lee's commander. And Eisenhower then blurted out, "I'd have sacked him." Well, probably reasonable on Ike's part, but what happened is that this was picked up by the Associated Press, and when Southern Americans heard that Eisenhower had criticized the vaunted Robert E. Lee, the vitriol that was directed at Eisenhower was phenomenal. And in fact, I've written an article about this and Eisenhower in the Civil War, which will be out next year in a book called The Long Civil War. And I was a little annoyed at Monty because he was not given to those kinds of statements, but Monty kind of pushed him to it. This picture is near and dear to my heart because that's Eisenhower throwing out the first ball at a new football stadium at my college, Gettysburg College, in the fall of 1965. Ike was on the board of trustees at the college, was not especially active, but did his duty. And one of his activities was to be at this special event. There's David in his Gettysburg Little League uniform, or perhaps Pony League. There's Susan on her pony. She was a great rider. This is, of course, right at the farm. And you can see the mountains right behind the farm, west of Gettysburg. And then this is General de Gaulle coming to pay his personal respects to Eisenhower when he dies in March of 1969 at the age of 78 of heart failure. De Gaulle was a royal pain in Eisenhower's neck during World War II. He was a problematic ally in 1958 and 59, although actually supported Ike wholeheartedly during the U-2 crisis and recognized what Eisenhower meant to his country and came especially to pay his respects. So that's what I'll say about the Gettysburg time. I'll just now briefly run through a number of slides about the Eisenhower Society, which was founded in 1969 by this gentleman on the right, Henry Scharf, who was a newspaper publisher and hotel owner in Gettysburg. The man on the left is a Republican congressman named Goodling, of no great consequence, but supported the Eisenhower Society. Scharf, along with a local lawyer named Charles Wolfe, who I think we have an image of, there he is, came up with the idea of trying to establish a society that would essentially share the legacy and convey the importance of Dwight Eisenhower. And that society celebrated its 50th anniversary just last year with a big gala dinner at which William Hitchcock of the University of Virginia gave a wonderful speech distilling a 600-page book that he recently published called The Age of Eisenhower, which I recommend highly to everybody. There's the Society's insignia. This is a lovely picture of downtown Gettysburg in 1955. Eisenhower was coming back from his heart attack, which he had suffered in Colorado while on vacation. And you can see the love that the locals had for him. By the way, if you see that Lincoln Room sign up there, that is the Wills House, and it is now a national park site. So you can go to the Wills House 9 to 5 any day and take in where Lincoln was the night before he gave the Gettysburg Address. There's my friend Carol Hegeman, second from the right and seated, with whom I worked on the Eisenhower teacher workshop for so many years, and members of the Eisenhower Society. I'm in the middle, I guess fourth from the left standing. and that's the people. The mission is to promote the memory and legacy of leadership of Dwight Eisenhower through education, scholarships, and special events. Of late, the scholarship side and the grant-making side has been very central to what the Eisenhower Society has been up to. The Society has given away roughly $1 million to various good causes relating to Eisenhower, among them scholarships for students to study abroad, among them support for films by George Colburn and Starbright Video on Eisenhower, support for the college and various programming that it's done related to Eisenhower's life and his presidency, as well as a couple of books that I've done, including the Encounters with Eisenhower book and a book that is now in progress on oral history of the Second World War. So the Society continues to act in the interest of sharing what we know and what we should know about Ike, and I encourage people to think about joining it. This is an interesting picture of Mamie in October of 1970 at the unveiling of the Eisenhower statue at Gettysburg College. And Mamie was just really emotional when she saw this statue and actually caressed his face. And that statue is still in front of the Eisenhower Admissions Building to this day at Gettysburg. There it is again. And this is some of the programming that the Eisenhower Society has done. This was a great program, I think, by Mike Nyberg about the First World War. There's President Ford with the statue. There's some kids getting their scholarships. So I exaggerated. Total grants are not $1 million, but you can see closing in on it. And that's with the conference on Ike and Khrushchev, the self-improvement awards for high school students, the preservation of Eisenhower artifacts at Gettysburg College, the internships at the historic site, the agricultural science field study for low-income students, the training manuals for a junior Secret Service agent program, which is a lot of fun for kids and it gets them into the history world, and the preservation of various artifacts in the Eisenhower home. And there's Carol working on oral history, that many of them that she conducted are now being transcribed. The film by George Colburn that I mentioned, which is available on DVD, and visits with the crew. All right, I think that that's about it. There's Ike's favorite golfer, Arnold Palmer, the Camp Colt Wayside exhibit, which is going on, the pine trees that need to be replaced on the drive leading to the farmhouse, and the annual picnic. I'll stop right there because I've gone on for about 50 minutes, and I would be happy to take questions if you have any.
Let me get everyone off mute. Thank you very much, Michael. That was excellent. I'll start off with a question, actually. Regarding the creation of NASA, how did Ike feel about our reliance on former Nazi rocket scientists, particularly Wernher von Braun?
That's a tough one. I would say that he didn't lose sleep over it. I think that Eisenhower was very pragmatic. I don't know what he would have said about Operation Paperclip when it was devised, which is, you know, the bringing
Right.
Nazis over after the war instead of punishing them. I think his attitude was that we were on the side of good, that the Russians had their own Nazi scientists and had their own homegrown scientists, and we had to be able to compete with them. Now, keep in mind, Eisenhower kept the United States distinctly, formidably ahead of the Russians in terms of our ability to wage a nuclear war, which, by the way, he intended never to wage. And if you want to know more about that, read Ike's Bluff by Evan Thomas, in which Eisenhower is going to tell no one what he really plans to do about nuclear war. But I don't think he had any problem giving public credit to Wernher von Braun for what he did for the American rocket program. And of course, some of you may remember, as I do, the wonderful lyrics of Tom Lehrer about Wernher von Braun, right? The rockets go up, but where they come down, that's not my department, said Wernher von Braun. And that was a case way von Braun thought about things. But I'll just stop there and say I don't think I've worried about it.
Okay. We have a question from Les. What is left of the house that Eisenhower bought?
Well, if you mean the Reading house, it was demolished. The Reading farmhouse was demolished. They kept the stones, some of the stones, which are now on the front face of the study. And it's actually not just the study is tiny. I mean, it's like 6 by 9. But then there is a lounge where Eisenhower sometimes took naps or played bridge with his friends, which also had a library in it. And that's faced by this stone. But almost nothing of the original house was left. Almost nothing.
Harry, you're on mute, Harry. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. What years did the Eisenhower family actually live at that property?
Well, the property was being renovated from roughly 1951 to 1955. It was finished, fortunately, just in time for Eisenhower to recuperate there after his heart attack in October of 55. He comes back to Gettysburg November, early December, I think, and then spends, sort of quarantine time in Gettysburg before he goes back full-time to his work in the White House. He would visit Gettysburg for holidays. He would visit Gettysburg for weekends, but he only moves in full-time in January of 1961. Let me just say one more word about that, too. He spent about 7 months a year in Gettysburg. He didn't like spending winters in the north, so he took advantage of an opportunity to move to California, to Palm Desert, where he had a home offered to him. And so he was able to play golf and he was able to conduct his business and do whatever he wanted to do in a warmer climate for 4 or 5 months every year. But it was his home until he had that massive heart attack in May of '68 and went to Walter Reed for the next 9 months until he passed away. Mamie Eisenhower lived in the house until she died in 1979, and then it was readied for opening as a National Historic Site.
I recall probably my first trip ever to Gettysburg, a family trip. I was probably about 8 years old, and my parents were simply, as part of the trip, thinking, well, let's go out and check out and see the Eisenhower farm. And of course, they were disappointed that he simply couldn't ride out and see the house. My mother was particularly disappointed, but I understand how that goes. It was off limits. Is that also Reading? Is that the famous Reading that has farms all over the Gettysburg area? Redding?
Oh, it is a popular name. I'm going to assume it's not. I mean, there was a Reading auctioneer for many years. In fact, he may still be in business, although the auction business has gone on the downward slide in the last 10 years. But yeah, I mean, there are certain names like Adamick and Reading and Hankey that are all over Adams County. I wouldn't assume that there was any direct relation.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, just quickly as an add-on to your comment, you still can't drive directly into the Eisenhower farm to visit it. And I think that's a downer for visitation, which they need to pay attention to. But it's sort of built or baked into their understanding with the federal government about what they can do with parking. And I think they're still working through that to try to find a way to let people drive over there. But I'm not in a position to know where they're going with it.
Thank you.
We have a question from Gary. Why is the Eisenhower Library in Abilene rather than Gettysburg?
Let me tell you something. That's something that is always on my mind when I have to pay a fortune to go and spend a week in Abilene to do my research. Well, it's because I spent his formative years in Abilene, and because the people in Kansas pushed really hard to get the library there. Whose libraries in even a more inaccessible place, West Branch, Iowa, even though Hoover lived much of his life in New York and around the world. The simple fact is that Abilene was his hometown, and the people in Kansas pushed really hard to build a library there, and he was not going to forsake them. So I think it would have been much easier for most of us if the library were in Gettysburg or somewhere else, but it's just the reality that it's going to be in Abilene forever.
Regarding Camp Colt, Michael, to what extent did that training ground encroach on the current battlefield areas?
Well, it did, yeah. Some of it is now a development at the south end of Gettysburg that went up in the 1950s. It's a pleasant development. But beyond that, where Camp Colt was, and again, Carol Hegeman's husband, Paul, has kind of laid all this out in the book that he hasn't yet finished. There were lots of properties that they used for everything. They had every kind of facility you could imagine, including swimming pools for these soldiers, libraries. They had railroad tracks. They had everything. And yes, it encroached on the battlefield. I want to also add something in this regard that's a tangent, but it's worth saying. One of the things that really struck me, I found this out reading a biography of Mamie, is that, I did not talk military stuff with Mamie, but there was one exception. He loved taking a car ride on Sundays through the battlefield and going with Mamie and talking through the battle with her. And it was a special moment for them that summer of 1918, where he actually shared with her his thoughts, feelings, learning about the Civil War. And it's the only time that I'm aware of where that ever happened in his life. The other thing he did, and he says this in one of his memoirs, is that other days when Mamie was not available, he would drive by himself to what he claimed was the spot where Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. And he would read the Gettysburg Address, he'd carry it with him at that spot, and he would ponder it. And I really think that's a very touching and indicative moment about Eisenhower.
Where was that spot?
Aha! Well, if you go to Gettysburg as a visitor, the spot is in an enclosed area where there's a statue and a gazebo. And that's where everybody thinks Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And the real spot was across the street in essentially part of the cemetery that exists across the street, not the military cemetery. The cemetery where Marianne Moore, the poet, is buried, along with a number of Gettysburg notables, like Eddie Plank, the baseball player. So that's a sore spot, I think, for some people, because I don't think that the spot that everybody thought where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address was really the spot. But you'd have to ask one of my Civil War compatriots to define that absolutely for you.
We have a question from Bernice. Was President Eisenhower influenced to declare gays a threat to the security of the U.S.?
That's a very interesting question. Let me see if I can boil it down. Eisenhower did not personally have prejudice against gay people. I don't know that you know this, but his national security advisor was gay. He was repressed homosexual. He was not out, but he was definitely homosexual. And Eisenhower knew it. I know he knew it. And he didn't dismiss him. That was Bobby Cutler. What Eisenhower did do, and this is not one of the things I'm proud of that he did, was he issued an executive order, in effect, saying that if you were gay, or if you were a philanderer or a drunk, you could be dismissed from your federal position. He argued that having a federal position of significance was a privilege, not a right. Now, I need to add, why does he say that? Why does he do it? He does it for two reasons. First, he was trying to respond to the McCarthy contagion to show Joe McCarthy that he didn't need Joe McCarthy to tell him what to do about national security matters. Harry Truman had effectively ferreted out the communists from the government with his policies, his loyalty program from 1947 to 1951. What you had for Eisenhower was what he called security risks, and that's where gay people fell in his estimation. There was such a thing in the early 1950s known as honey traps, where people who might be in possession of classified information would be lured into either a heterosexual or a homosexual assignation by a Russian plant. Now, some of you who are listening to this may have vague memories of a very well-known columnist named Joseph Alsop, who was not a supporter of Eisenhower, I might add. And Joseph Alsop happened to be traveling in Moscow in the 1950s, and he was lured into, he was gay, although he was in the closet. He was lured into one of these assignations. He had his photograph taken, and the Russians intended to blackmail him. What Alsop did, in many ways, was quite courageous. They slid the photographs under the door for him so he could see what they had done to him. He carried those photographs to Sherman Adams in the White House, and he didn't like Sherman Adams at all for a variety of reasons. And he said, "This is the deal. I just want you to know this is what I am, and I'm not going to adhere to any blackmail threats by the Russians." Eisenhower couldn't count on someone who was an assistant secretary of this or that to do it. By the way, if you're interested in this subject and want a good read that is not hard to follow but deals with the nuances, there's a novel by Thomas Mallon called Fellow Travelers, which deals with this issue with great sensitivity. And I think it's worth reading if you're interested in the subject. There's also a great book by a historian called The Lavender Scare, which lays out in detail what Eisenhower did with that population. And let me close my comments by saying, I do not want to excuse Eisenhower for his policy. I just want to explain it as best I can.
Michael, you mentioned your upcoming book, The Long Civil War. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, it's not my book. It's a book edited by two distinguished historians, one from the University of North Carolina and one from Florida State University. And they wanted to do a book in which different historians wrote essays about how the Civil War continued to impact Americans long after the last fighting. And one of them asked me if I had anything that I might want to say about that. And I'm not a Civil War historian per se, even though I have edited 3 books on Buchanan. So I happened to say, well, look, Eisenhower was impacted by the Civil War, and I could write an essay about that, and I did, and they liked it, and it's been through the whole vetting process, and the book will be out next year from the University Press of Kentucky. So David, it's an essay. It's one of 10 essays in what will be a book called The Long Civil War, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in print.
Sounds good. Do we have any other questions for Michael?
Yes, it's Frank.
Yes, Frank.
Michael, how does Ike get involved with the tank group, with tank training? And in his tank training, as I understand it, they run across the battlefields. Did he have any feelings about that was chopping up the battlefield?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I have no evidence that he did. Again, if anybody will come across it, it'll be Carol's husband, Paul Shevchuk, because he's like basically going at this at a micro level. But, you know, I've read Eisenhower's memoirs, and I don't see anything in which he says he thought about it twice. Remember, he only, I think, had 1 tank while he was in Gettysburg. So I don't know how much he could have really ripped up the battlefield that way. They were ripping the battlefield up for housing and for recreation, much more than for tank training. I think that would be my best answer. But you got to remember something, that I think environmental consciousness and historical preservationism were really in a different place in people's consciousnesses than they would become later on. I mean,
Right.
why else did we lose Penn Station in the 1960s? When you think about that, you know, we get that horrible Madison Square Garden in its place. that's just a mentality shift that has happened since the 1960s. So I don't think he likely would have given it much thought. He would have said, oh, they can plant new grass.
Thank you.
Steve, did you have a question?
Yes, is the farm still a major player in the Angus beef program? They used to do a whole lot of breeding experiments and things like that. I'm just curious about that.
That's a good question, Steve. The short answer is I don't know. Eisenhower himself closed up the Angus beef operation while he was still alive. As he said when he turned 75, I want to tidy my affairs up somewhat. And that's when he did that. I have seen in the last few years Angus cows on the property or adjacent property, but exactly what they're doing there and what they're using them for is out of my realm. I just don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Excellent.
Tremendous program.
Good.
I'm delighted to talk with you and be happy to come back and talk about Ike and the Civil War someday.
Well, and we want to get back in touch with you on James Buchanan as well.
Well, very good. I'd be happy to do that too. You're a great group. Thank you so much. The questions were excellent. And I wish you well and have fun with Kevin Levin and the Black Confederates, such as there were Black Confederates. You all
Hang on for one moment.
Yeah, don't hold up yet.
Rich,
All right,
our
I got
president.
to go back. All right, just a couple things to point out. You couldn't see them here, but I'm actually wearing a NASA shirt.
all right.
Okay, so I just crossed my mind that Eisenhower did that. And I've been to the farm, and it's a good tour for anybody who wants to go. And I've been to Abilene too. Not as interesting, but as Truman's place, but it's a good place to be. One comment on your presentation, when you're showing the pictures, I found it interesting that he showed the gentleman from India a cow. With the first thing across my mind.
That's
Like,
right.
really, a cow? Okay. We wanted to thank you again for doing such a great job and enlightening us on Eisenhower. We wanted to, you'll be getting a package soon that'll have some things, including a certificate of appreciation and we'll build the Irish fluted drinking glass, a all-baldy pen, and our history. But most importantly, Arlene will be sending you an email for presenting to us tonight. You will get a 1-year honorary membership for our roundtable, which means you'll be invited to all of our future presentations, so you can tune in or visit if you're in the area. So once again, thank you very much. And like Dave said, we might be contacting you in the future to learn more about Buchanan and I think you said you did a book on a relationship with him and Thaddeus Stevens. Right?
Yeah, well, thank you on all of those counts. I appreciate it. And I hope to take advantage of some of your programs. So thanks a lot for that, too.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
And is Robert and Ricky still on? Tell us who you are if you are. Okay. Thank you.